Off in the salty ocean, off where the waves roll free. The sparkling water rises, then crashes to the sea. Out amongst the breakers, you'll have no need to fear. It's true, it's the blue frontier.
Welcome to another episode of Rising Tide, the Ocean Podcast. This is David Helvarg, and my co-host, after so many years, remains the vivacious Vicki Nichols of the Inland Ocean Coalition.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you, David.
And thank you. Today, we're honored to have as our guest author and educator, Paul Greenberg. But first, some blue news you can use. And I know what you're thinking. Helvarg's doom scrolling again. What is it this time? Marine heat waves, an oil spill on a coral reef? The Trump administration's done something stupid again? But not this time, because the ocean is also beautiful, mysterious, and filled with unexplained wonders like the deep sea's golden orb. In 2023, NOAA scientists discovered a reflective golden orb in the depths 2 miles below the Pacific off Alaska. This led to speculation it might be part of a UFO or an ancient urn. But genome sequencing now reveals it's a blob of deep-sea anemone's cuticle, like a jewel bug's carapace, or possibly what was left over when the anemone shucked its skin. But wait, if that burst your bubble like the swim bladder of a deep-sea fish brought up too quickly, you've probably seen those 16th and 19th century illustrations of ships being dragged under by giant octopi known as krakens. Exaggeration, you say? Well, let's talk about another wonderful possibility. A new report in the journal Science suggests that a 60-foot octopus ruled the seas 100 million years ago. Dozens of jaw fossils suggest they were aggressive predators that could eat any marine reptile of their day. You might recall the first coelacanth calf, fossil fish that was thought to have got extinct 70 million years ago, but was discovered very much alive in the deep waters off Africa in 1938, with many more living specimens seen since. So who's to say a kraken or two might not still be down there? So next time you go in the ocean, you don't have to fear being eaten by a great white shark. You may be sucker grabbed and taken into the flesh-tearing beak of a not-so-mythical giant kraken. Hope that restores your appreciation for the wonders of the ocean. And that's more blue news you can use. Paul's the author of 7 books, including the New York Times bestseller 4 Fish, The Future of the Last Wild Food, and A Third Term, in which George Washington takes on Donald Trump. So, obviously, his writing has range. He's a writer in residence at the Safina Center, founded by our former guest and friend Carl Safina. He's been a Pew Fellow and received many other honors. He teaches at NYU's Animal Studies program, and at least to his knowledge, I believe this is the only vintner-growing wine in Lower Manhattan. So, lots to cover, Paul, but let's start where we usually do, which is how and when did you first connect with the ocean?
Oh, it was pretty early on. When my parents divorced, I was about 3 years old, and we started having these divorced dad weekends. And divorced dad weekends in the 70s mostly consisted of dads figuring out what parenting actually meant. Because up until that point, I think a lot of dads in the 70s were kind of autopiloting their way through parenting, with the moms doing 99% of the work. So my dad suddenly had us, my brother and me, on the weekends. And I think he had this thought that a man should take his sons fishing. The problem was he didn't know how to fish.
Right.
So he took us out on, I don't know what they're called on the West Coast, but on the East Coast, they're called party boats. And they're boats that it's a pay per fare situation. I think they call them open boats or head boats out West. I can't remember.
Head boats, party boats.
Yeah.
Lots of people lining the rails with lots of rods and reels.
Yeah. And as my father would say, you meet a better class of people there. It's a pretty rough crew. It's usually people fishing actually for food. Although there's a bit of everything there. And there was always a poker game at the front of the boat. My father went for the poker and I went for the fishing. But in between, I kind of ended up teaching my father how to fish, because I would spend a lot of time talking to the mates, talking to the captains, talking to the Sharpies aboard. And I learned a lot of stuff from them. And then my father, meanwhile, was playing poker. So when he came to the rail, he didn't know what he was doing. Anytime a child feels empowered to be the knowledge holder, that's very exciting.
Magic.
And it only encouraged me. And so I fished the Brooklyn party boats to some degree. Our favorite place was Captree in the South Shore of Long Island near Babylon. It was actually, I recently read The Power Broker for the first time. about Robert Moses, and I came to realize that actually the whole Captree Boat Basin was a Moses creation to a large degree. So we fished Captree. We would fish the Sheepshead Bay party boats. On a special occasion, I convinced him, my dad, to take us out to Montauk, and we'd go out. We'd go out on the Viking Starship, which was like heated rails for cod fishing in the winter. Although they were so hot, my father called it the molten rail, because while you were fighting fish, if you touched your bare wrist to the rail, you literally you have little burn marks on your wrist. But and then as we ventured further afield, I fished quite a bit on Martha's Vineyard.
So to fast forward, how did your fishing through your youth lead to broader interest in writing in oceans?
So the writing thing kind of came through a different angle. My father was a psychiatrist, but he also wrote a lot of film criticism. The Jewish ideal is that your son becomes a doctor. And my father really wished he hadn't become a doctor, and he wished he'd become a creator. And so rather than pushing me down the road of medicine, which his mother pushed him down, he was much more interested in our developing talent in the creative sphere. So my older brother he's a screenwriter, and he writes like Halloween H2O or Children of the Corn Part 3. And so it was sort of a desire to write. And then I worked for a number of years for a nonprofit called Internews. And so I worked in the former Soviet Union, actually developing independent television stations in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And all this stuff accrued a kind of life of its own. And I ended up writing a novel based on that. Well, I also married a Soviet woman right out of college. That was, as Paul Auster would say, the future ex-Mrs. Greenberg. And so I wrote this novel loosely based on that. And actually, it went somewhere. It was funny because when I wrote that book,
what was it called?
It's called Leaving Katya. And when I wrote it, I got an agent after many, many attempts. And the agent said, I like this book. I think I could sell it. It's not going to sell to a big publishing house because it's a small book. And I said, what do you mean small books? Well, it's not going to get a major house. Then a major house bought it. GP Putnam bought it. And the editor took me to lunch, and she said, I love this book. I'm really looking forward to publishing it, but you should know that it's a small book. And I was like, why is it a small book? It's a love story set amidst the collapse of an empire. She's like, well, just Barnes & Noble's not going to notice it. Then it got picked to be a Barnes & Noble Discover Great New Writers selection, where people like Susan and Orlean and stuff got their stuff there, discovered there. But then everyone at Putnam got fired because the boss of the house at the time was the woman Phyllis Grand, who discovered Tom Clancy, but she got fired, and everyone associated with her got fired, and my project got put into a little box and thrown away. And so I kind of was in the wilderness for a while, and then I went on this sort of holy war to try and get publicity for that book, and wrote to every contact I knew. And then somebody at the Boston Globe Ideas section named Jennifer Schuessler, the Ideas reporter at the New York Times, but it was during the first Iraq War, and she said, I think this war is going to end someday. And we just started this section at the Boston Globe called the Idea section. And I heard that you like to fish. Would you like to do like a thinking piece about fishing? And I thought, okay. And then I had this thought, whenever you have two fish that occupy the same niche, like for an angler, one becomes the good one and one becomes the bad one. So like if you're fishing in New England, topwater, the striped bass is the good fish, and the bluefish is the one that gets in the way and ends up in the garbage can. So I wrote this sort of think piece about it, and it turns out it actually goes all the way back to Isaac Walton, which you might remember wrote a book called The Complete Angler in the 17th century. It was considered the first fishing manual. But it turns out I found out that book is actually an extended allegory, and he speaks of the salmon being the noble regent and the pike being the tyrant. And it turns out the regent, he was implying Charles I, and the tyrant, the pike, was Cromwell, who eventually had Charles beheaded. So anyway, so I wrote this thing.
As we behead many of our fish.
Exactly. So that piece did really well. It was kind of pre-internet, so I don't have the metrics on it. But what I do know is that Marty Barron, who you may know from the Spotlight investigation of the Catholic Church in Boston, he was the editor-in-chief of the Boston Globe at the time. And when the story ran, he walked down to my editor's desk and he said, this is the kind of story I want in my newspaper, which was that was thrilling. I have to, as a sidebar, to say the next story Jenny was like, my editor was like, got anything else? And it's like, oh yeah, I'd like to write something about the Brown University Semiotics department because I studied semiotics at Brown. And so I did this piece on semiotics, and I thought it was really good. It starts with this great lead with Ira Glass, and who also is a semiotics guy. And after that article ran, Marty Barron came down to my editor's desk and he said, I never, ever want to see the word semiotics in my newspaper ever again. So that was the high point and low point.
And remind us what the study of semiotics is.
It's the study, semiotics from semio meaning a sign. And so it's sort of like deconstructing texts, be they films or books or whatever, to find the sort of hidden meaning. And it's got a strong Marxist component. And a lot of serious people came out of the semiotics program, like Rick Moody, Jeff Eugenides, and I say Ira Glass. Ira Glass had a funny story. When he graduated with a semiotics degree, he came down from the podium with his diploma in his hands, and his father had taken out an ad in the Baltimore Sun, a fake ad, and he gave it to him. The ad said, "International firm seeks semiotics grads for high-paying position." So anyway, but I mean, it was actually influential in how I ended up thinking about the ocean, because I think, as David, you've written a bunch of books, you've read a ton of books. I think you actually reviewed For Fish for the Chronicle back in the was Bush. But there's a lot, when you think about it, there's a lot of actually really superficial work being done about the ocean. Oh, how I love it, how I appreciate it, these kind of blah blah meditations. And what semiotics helped me to see was to understand that humans in the end of the day, when it comes to the wild world, are reductionists and simplifiers, which is the essence of our problem with the planet, is that we don't tolerate complexity very well, especially in our food systems. And so this desire to simplify things into things that we recognize on a menu or that we recognize in a supermarket aisle compels us to do away with the rest of the natural world. There was a very important piece of reading I did early on. There was a scientist named Galton, who was actually a cousin of Darwin. And he wrote a very influential piece about the domestication of animals. He listed these 7 or 8 criteria that an animal needs to be successfully domesticated. And then he has this great line: all the rest of the world, of the worlds of animals, are destined to be wiped off the face of the earth because of their inefficiency or their inability to accommodate humankind. I'm paraphrasing, but that was in a sense. And I was like, whoa. And then keep in mind, it's a Victorian era.
And when was this written?
This was, I think, this is 1890s or something. And he's a contemporary of Darwin. He's also a eugenicist. He's considered one of the first people to start thinking about, because remember, Darwinism and eugenics and social Darwinism, they all were of a piece back in the day. And we thought that Darwin's laws applied to race, applied to class, all these kinds of things. And while I don't agree with him that the rest of the world should be wiped off the face of the earth, I do think that we tend to domesticate what we can. And so to some degree, For Fish was the story of what we chose to domesticate and how the wild fights for its survival in the face of both extirpation in the form of fishing/hunting, but then also domestication has its own problems that it inflicts on the ocean.
I love that cover. I think it's great. And it's really about how humans manage or fail to manage these shared resources.
Yeah.
And you picked the 4 iconic ones: salmon, sea bass, cod, tuna, not really as food, but kind of almost like a case study, I think, when you are looking at like in human decision making.
Yeah.
So what do you think these fish reveal about us and humans? And why did you actually pick those 4?
I was trying to go from a place of what most people knew about. And I looked to some degree at what were the most consumed seafoods. Salmon is salmon is the most consumed fish that we eat. And then after that is tuna. And I should say our tuna, because when I say salmon, when I say tuna, there are multiple species that fit under this kind of flesh archetype. Cod, again, if you look at the sort of 3rd most consumed seafoods, or 4th, I guess, it's a basket of what the industrial world calls the whitefish market. And cod is just one of a bunch of different white fish. So by using that, I was able to look at both the epic destruction of cod, which those of us who are fishy know about from Mark Kurlansky's book, which, by the way, I just wrote the intro to the 30th anniversary of cod by Mark Kurlansky. And the fourth fish, the sea bass, it's not necessarily in that order, but sea bass, that was actually a kind of exercise in semiotics, because what I thought was interesting about that chapter was you have this word bass, right? And there's this disjunction between a common name and a scientific name. A scientific name indicates a precise genus and species, whereas a common name is very slippery and it passes over all kinds of fish. And what I thought was interesting about the bass thing, whereas it's not, unlike the other three, it's really not what I would consider like a top flight fish that you would see on every single menu. It does represent so many shifts and swapping of one fish for another that there was a good narrative to tell. My way into bass originally was that my stepmother came to me one day and she said, "I've discovered a new fish and I just love it and I order it all the time." And I said, "What is this fish?" And she said, "It's a branzino." And, we are all on this call old enough to remember a time when there were no branzino in the market. And branzino, it's also known as the European sea bass. It's actually quite closely related to the American striped bass. They actually are from the same genus. I spent a lot of time talking about the taming of the European sea bass, the branzino, and how that came to market, because that was an interesting thing that had to be figured out. It's funny, when you've been on tour with a book for a while, you figure out how to talk about it in a way that kind of is not, it's kind of, as we'd say in semiotics, it's sort of extra diegetic in that it doesn't refer to what's in the text. It's more expounding upon the text. And so
I run into extra diegetic events almost every day of my life.
Yeah, exactly. And so, there's interesting tie-ins. Also, when you're speaking, you don't have to be as precise as you are when you're writing. Nobody's going to fact check your lecture. I mean, they will, but you try not to. But there's an interesting thing that previous to writing For Fish, I'd done a piece for the New York Times Magazine about Chilean sea bass.
I was just going to say Patagonian toothfish.
Yeah, which is again another fish that gets named bass, even though they're not even related on a family level to American striped bass or European sea bass. They're actually, you have to go all the way up to a level in order to find a commonality between Chilean sea bass and striped bass and European sea bass. And one of the things I do in my lecture when I talk about the sort of swapping in a bass is I show all the different things that get called sea bass. Like, for example, out in California, the California white sea bass is actually closer to a weak fish, but it's called a sea bass. But anyway, after I've gone through all the basses and all the swapping, I show them all, and then I show up a slide of a ring-tailed lemur and my son, and I show that where they intersect at the level of an order, which is where Chilean sea bass and striped bass come into play.
What is Rising Tide? Rising Tide is Blue Frontier's bi-weekly half-hour show that features a diversity of ocean voices, from the famous to the fascinating, deep-sea explorers to whale wranglers, Arctic residents to climate justice warriors. With public broadcasting under attack, Blue Frontier offers Rising Tide and all associated content for free to community and public radio stations across the nation. We need your support to keep producing our salty, in-depth conversations. A tax-deductible donation at bluefront.org will help us keep getting the word out about our awesome blue planet. And now, back to the show.
What's your present engagement? I mean, you're in the animal program division at NYU, you're teaching. How do you look at the immediate challenges in terms of the greater part of our country that's saltwater?
Yeah, well, I mean, I come at it first and foremost as a creator and how can I write something interesting about it? My latest project, I'm going to Sicily in July to look at the swordfish fishery. Everyone has got excited about bluefin tuna and saving them, and really we've had quite a bit of success in turning bluefin tuna around. But meanwhile, the swordfish has really been thrown under the bus. And
under the boat, you're correct.
And there's a lot of really interesting stuff going on with swordfish. There's an all-woman harpoon crew out of Messina. There's long-lining. The fish are getting smaller and smaller, just like they did here. But I also kind of want to look at it more spiritually as I get older. I mean, I'm 58, so I was, I guess, late 30s, early 40s when I wrote For Fish. And, it was a different part of my life. I just had a son, and so I was very much involved with, I don't know, just thinking more immediately in front of me. Whereas the Swordfish Project, it has me thinking a lot about Hemingway, has me thinking about Hemingway's suicide. It has me thinking about The Old Man and the Sea. And as you get closer to the exit, right, you think more about not necessarily your legacy, but like I think it was Kierkegaard who said, "How does this sit with my being?" And I think as all this like deep ecology stuff starts to happen, and Robin Wall Kimmerer and the indigenous knowledge being incorporated into Western knowledge, I think it's clear that while the environmental movement, the 60s and 70s, were extremely important, got us really far, it didn't change our essential psychology around the earth. Like, I think the fact that so much is able to be rolled back in like 14 months by one jerk means that its roots weren't deep enough. So this has me thinking, like, what could I do that was sort of a deep roots approach?
We've gone through the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act. We've seen burning rivers. We've seen fishery populations decline, and you would feel like Earth Day, and like nobody's really screaming.
Yeah.
And you're right. What kind of questions should we be asking that we're not, to kind of get to that core question of why haven't we gone deep enough?
I think we took a bad turn by throwing the entirety of our weight into climate change. And it's not that I don't believe in climate change. It's not that I don't feel its effects. And it's not that I don't think it's extremely important. But from an electoral point of view, it's a disaster. Here's the ask when it comes to climate change. I want you to change almost everything in your life so that your great-grandchildren, who won't know your name, might live slightly better. Like, that's the ask.
But I'd say that's the bad approach. The reality is, on this show, we interviewed the AFL-CIO in Rhode Island because now solar and wind, offshore wind, is cheaper than oil and gas. And so you see this thing where Trump is actually fighting against the market, trying to shut down offshore wind, which is...
Yeah, but
so the argument should be, it's good for the economy, it's good for your life, it's cheaper utility bills, it's
exactly. But instead, it should be that. It should be like a bazillion little things to make your community better. Taking out a dam will lower your flood risk, return diadromous fish to your neighborhood, and or what about this? I wrote a book a few years ago called The Climate Diet. It's just sort of about sort of what you personally can do around climate. And I came across this really good term called afforestation. And it was kind of coined by this professor in New England somewhere. And he was saying what if afforestation is not necessarily planting trees everywhere, but looking at trees that are somewhere in there, that from the age of about 20 to 100 is the time in the lifespan of a tree when they sequester the most carbon, especially fast-growing trees like a white pine. The tendency of forestry, right, is to cut down after 30 years or something and then reboot. So this afforestation idea, not only does it sequester a lot of carbon, but wouldn't everyone like to have a big, beautiful forest rather than a sort of spindly, ugly, second growth kind of thing? So things like that. We need to find a whole host of arguments that, yes, address climate change, but for which it's not the major thing. And then, frankly speaking, I don't really like this glomming on to climate change, that this sort of intersectionality thing that comes up, like, oh, it's about race, it's about gender, it's about I mean, sure, right, great, throw that stuff in. But as soon as you make it politically about that, then you push environmentalism into the realm of the far left, which, I may agree with many goals of the far left, but the electoral reality is that many people are immediately pushed off about it.
The dividing line.
Yeah. So that's what I think. I think it was a dogleg. The whole act locally, think globally. That's good. That makes sense. That makes sense to people.
You've touched on politics, oceans, environment, mindsets, mind shifts. What gives you hope right now?
Well, actually, Bluefin Tuna give me hope. The fact that when I wrote Four Fish, that was like the last scene, the last fishing scene. In Four Fish, almost every chapter has me going fishing, and usually I hook something. And in the last chapter of Four Fish, I'm out on this tuna boat off of North Carolina, and they're shooting a fishing show, and they've got this professional angler, and he's sitting in the fighting chair ready for the bluefin to bite. And there's a huge flock of gannets and terns, and they're just diving on this school of menhaden, and there's porpoises jumping, and it seems really full of life, but there's no tuna. There's just nothing underneath it. I left the reader with that image, like it's like a machine missing its gear. And in this ensuing years, thanks to people like Barb Block and incredible international cooperation, bluefin are now rebuilding faster than people thought they were. And they're Pacific, Southern, and Atlantic bluefin are all rebuilding really quickly. But it's kind of a cliche to say that the ocean is resilient. People say that kind of thing, but actually to see it happen with one of the largest megafaunas out there in the ocean, that was really inspiring. So I always say, when you add up all the fish that we take from the sea every year, it's 80 to 90 million metric tons. It's the equivalent of the human weight of China taken out of the sea. And you could say, on the one hand, that's a tremendous savaging, raping of the ocean. How could we do this year in and year out? On the other hand, you could flip around and say, wow, the ocean continues to produce a human weight of China as a wild system each and every year. And so rather than just, oftentimes if I'll say, I'm writing a book about the ocean, and everyone goes, oh, the ocean's dead. Ocean's dead. But compared to terrestrial systems, the ocean's a good deal healthier. There are no condos in the ocean. We haven't emptied out the ocean to the degree that we did with the Great Plains and replaced wild bison with cows. So
No, I mean, California, we're the fourth largest economy in the world, 40 million people. We live well by our coast and ocean. That resiliency story is true if you just take the basic steps of protection and restoration. And again, we don't know if we're going to ultimately have what we'd like to see, which is a healthy biodiversity on the planet. All we know is if we don't try, we lose. So we keep trying. We keep getting inspired by books like For Fish. We maybe have a chuckle and look at our screwed up political system and hope we get past celebrity fascism, reading books like George Washington versus Donald Trump. I know which side I'm on.
Paul Greenberg, author, fisherman, and winemaker. Thank you for joining us on the Rising Tide Ocean Podcast.
My great pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us on the Rising Tide Ocean Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen, and leave us a review or share it with your friends and other ocean lovers. Follow us on Instagram and visit bluefront.org for more updates and additional resources. Rising Tide is a production of Blue Frontier, co-hosted by David Helvarg and me, Vicki Nichols Goldstein of the Inland Ocean Coalition, with production support from Holden Hardcastle of Fluid Studios, Natasha Benjamin, and Nick Paz, and editing services provided by Charles Landon of Studio Cape May. Thanks for listening, and until next time, stay hopeful and stay salty.
Off in the salty ocean, off where the waves roll free. The sparkling water rises, then crashes to the sea. Out amongst the breakers, you'll have no need to fear. It's true, it's the blue frontier. Off in the salty ocean, off to the blue frontier.
Sparky, come here, buddy. Sparky. There you are. Good boy, Sparky.